You are listening to Certification Conversations from the BSI Education podcast in collaboration with BSI Certification, helping organizations to embed best practice. Today's episode is on PAS 2060, demonstrating carbon neutrality.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs, and this is Certification Conversations, a series from the BSI Education podcast, developed in collaboration with our friends at BSI Certification. This series features some key standards and certification schemes and explores how they help organisations of all types and in all sectors to improve the way they do things and to get to where they need to go. With our guests, we discuss how organisations can use standards to manage psychological health and safety in the workplace, how they can provide better customer service, and how they can provide protections for vulnerable consumers. This episode is about the standard PAS 2060, demonstrating carbon neutrality, and our guest is Dan Kuszpit from BSI. I spoke to Dan about the standard and how it helps organisations. Before we hear from him, here's a quick guide to PAS 2060.
PAS 2060 is the internationally recognized specification for carbon neutrality. Updated in 2014, it sets out requirements for quantification, reduction, and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions for organizations, products, and events. The standard enables organizations to demonstrate that their carbon neutrality claims are credible. A PAS, or publicly available specification, is a fast-track standardization document, the result of an expert consulting service from BSI. Sponsored by industry leaders, government and public sector, trade associations, or professional bodies, around 30% of PASs have gone on to form the basis of international standards.
Hi Dan, welcome to the BSI Education podcast.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you. Now, let's begin like we do with all of our guests. What's been your standards journey? How did it start for you, and where are you now?
I think like a lot of people listening, perhaps by accident, I made an application to BSI some 6 years ago now, and here I am. It's as the Biz Development Manager for BSI here in Scotland. It's been a one where there are a lot of clients, of course, in Scotland and throughout the UK where I support their standards journey from what is ISO 9001, 14001 and the likes, and I essentially act as the conduit between that request and them indeed in attaining that certification.
Now, obviously, you're talking to you in Scotland, and the entire world actually is looking at Scotland and Glasgow in particular at the moment, because COP26 is taking place as we're recording. And obviously, an important issue around the whole issue of climate change is around carbon neutrality. But what does carbon neutrality actually mean, and why does it matter?
I think carbon neutrality is an interesting one because, of course, terminology is where a lot of people are looking for solutions just now. Net zero carbon, carbon free, carbon negative. There are a lot of claims being made by a variety of governments, organisations, and of course targets that they're setting themselves on net zero. And I think the carbon neutrality itself relates to, I guess the technical aspects would mean not having a period by which you are not emitting any more than you did in that period before.
Now, earlier we heard our quick guide to PAS 2060. Why was the standard created, and what problem does it seek to solve?
So the creation of it goes right the way back to the development of the publicly available specification, typically a need which is required to be addressed rapidly, where the Standards Committee convene to answer a problem and indeed gather thoughts and opinion on what is indeed carbon neutrality and what do they seek to solve from it. The sponsorship of this was actually to do with the environmental agency in Taiwan, where of course they were one of the committee members developing the standard back in 2014 ahead of publication. What does it seek to solve? It's very much pertinent now. Here we are 7 years on, where there is again this terminology deficit, where there are many solutions perhaps available for organisations and us indeed as consumers to think about our footprint. But from a standards perspective, it of course allows that repeatability in order to commit that response and indeed set a target for yourself.
And how do organisations actually use PAS 2060?
So it's a bit like footprints in the snow, where I guess any standard is used because it is that common recipe, perhaps, that you can refer to set that path. But I think footprints in the snow, where you can imagine if you're going off doing your own thing, you could end up very confused and perhaps lost and not meeting your destination. Whereas if someone has indeed walked that path for you, I particularly use footprints, but of course a lot of this revolves around our own carbon footprint. But if you were to follow in those footprints, then you can indeed have one clear focused area by which to make your journey towards net zero. And I firmly believe carbon neutrality is indeed one of the first ways that we can do that. So from our experience with organisations seeking to understand more about PAS 2060, they themselves are somewhere on their journey towards net zero, but indeed their own personal knowledge isn't there. But of course, they are being sought by their own internal teams and perhaps senior management to forge this path for the organisation. Now, typically in my 5.5 years with BSI, it has been quality managers, health and safety managers, environment managers, to work with them on their management systems and indeed the certification to other standards. Now, PAS 2060 in itself, again, is new terminology for people. So having the standard, having access to it, it requires you to define and measure your carbon footprint using the information you gather from that, the data that you may already have available to you. You then use the standard to look at areas perhaps to reduce, and you formulate a carbon reduction plan. If you then have unavoidable measurements of carbon from your output, you would then look to perhaps offset those. And again, the standard points to certain areas where, from a carbon credits perspective, again, that you have this avenue where you're trying to decide which carbon credits and which route do I go down. Again, the standard specifies within there areas to look at for offsetting. Once you have all that in place, the latter part is to look at, again, defining and measuring to see if your reductions are actually working, but you document that in what is called a qualifying explanatory statement, which those that are going on this journey, they would then publicly share that. And it's something they then revisit every year for their reporting period. The validation piece is where BSI ourselves would come in and verify the information that's contained within that to ensure that we can indeed quantify it, verify it based on historical evidence, in order to claim PAS 2060 verification.
Here's me interrupting my conversation with Dan to tell you that for more information on BSI Education, go to bsigroup.com/education. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what we do here on the #BSIPod and you listen to us via Apple Podcasts, then please consider giving us a 5-star rating. It's quick and easy, and it really does make a difference to us being found via search and recommendations. Share us on social media using that #BSIPod, and if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, or even ideas for future episodes, then please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback. In this second part of my conversation with Dan, he refers to Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Scope 1 are the greenhouse gas emissions that an organisation makes directly, for example while running its boilers and vehicles. Scope 2 are the emissions it makes indirectly, like when the electricity or energy it buys for heating and cooling buildings is being produced on its behalf. Scope 3 are emissions the organisation is indirectly responsible for up and down its value chain, for example, for its products when customers use them. Emissions-wise, Scope 3 is nearly always the big one. So you've talked there about the sort of process about how an organisation would take and use the standard. I suppose looking then beyond that, it's been adopted and used. What are the benefits for that organisation of using PAS 2060?
I think, again, going to the point of where we find ourselves in the marketplace of the routes to net zero. And again, that targets 2045 for the Scottish Government, 2050 for the UK Government. Organisations will be a major part in government strategies for this, where they themselves have to be thinking about the scopes 1, 2 and 3, the position they play in the supply chain of indeed clients and suppliers, and ultimately supporting each other in this and doing our bit, not just as consumers, but organisations, to cut through the claims and of course substantiate those. And that's where PAS 2060 really helps, is to have this common place, this common goal, and this point of reflection where the committee themselves have established this as the standard for carbon neutrality. Beyond that, the substantiation of claims, understanding more about greenhouse gases, and of course, it's consumer confidence. Again, the position you play in the supply chain, the ability to have shoulders back from what impact you have on the environment, to understand the data and ensure that it's accurate, it's verifiable, and indeed, as we start to move through into the communication of the Competition and Markets Authority and the likes, looking to really stamp down on greenwashing, as is very much common in any market right now. It's the opportunity to again substantiate where your position is on that. Carbon neutrality may not be indeed the route that you choose to go down, but it is absolutely one of the first steps towards your net zero journey.
Now, if organisations do choose to go down that route as you described there, who is the standard for? What type and size of organisations?
So interestingly, again, from the other management system standards, your ISO 9001, 14001, the likes, which are very much organisation-led, where a management system is put in place according to the standard. This is a standard where it is almost agnostic, where anything from a business, a product, an event, can all use PAS 2060 as their means of identifying opportunities to reach carbon neutrality. For example, you've mentioned obviously COP26. Here we are in Scotland, where the world is indeed eyes on, and PAS 2060 is of course being used by the conference to be one of the first COPs to achieve carbon neutrality, and using PAS 2060 is of course an absolute vote of confidence into where people should commit their knowledge and their journey towards carbon neutrality and indeed net zero, as the world of course looks to COP26 for the solutions and of course the legacy that it then leaves. I think PAS 2060, it's a real vote of confidence to have the COP certified to that.
And are there any other requirements or systems that organisations or events that need to have in place in order to use PAS 2060?
There's no one requirement, I would say, before PAS 2060, but PAS itself mentions other avenues. So ISO 14064, Part 1 is a way in which they can determine their footprints, their scopes, relating to greenhouse gases and the 7 gases that may play part in their estate. It's one area where they can support that. Others, PAS 2050, if you're very much from in goods and services, it allows you to calculate the footprints from those. PAS 2080 is very focused towards infrastructure and the elements of your carbon footprint within that. So there are many supporting standards. Again, going back to COP26, ISO 2012-1, there was a standard that was created in the run-up to the London Olympics. And because the event of indeed COP26 for the size that it is, and a sustainable event, the applicability of ISO 2012-1 is absolutely there as well. And we're delighted that they've chosen BSI to certify them on that.
And how does PAS 2060 relate to other standards that support the achievement of net zero?
So again, from my experience with the likes of the environmental managers that we communicate with in my role, ISO 14001 is one of the most common that is adopted internationally, and ISO 14001 in its most recent guise would talk about the environmental impact aspects, talking about your life cycle of products from a manufacturing perspective. So again, the introduction of that into creating an environmental management system will support organisations into determining their position in the supply chain and indeed their impact from an environmental perspective. That indeed includes legislative when we're looking at the controls that you have in place for that. Beyond that, you also have ISO 50001, an energy management standard, where organisations that would have to comply with ESOS would be able to use ISO 50001 as their control from an energy management perspective. That would also feed into PAS 2060, again, from an energy usage when you're gathering that data to support where your readiness for PAS 2060 and indeed picking that up for the first time. It's probably a path that you have already created yourself, and indeed data that is inherent within the organisation. You'll have that at your fingertips. So the suite of standards from a sustainability perspective are indeed there to support. We also have other areas from a thought leadership perspective as the national standards body, where our net zero barometer reports talk about the readiness of industries in particular sectors for this, and it goes into further detail about the applicability of 14,001, 50,001 and the likes for organisations. As a final thought, recently the committee for ISO 14068 met, as that standard is looking to be updated and perhaps replace PAS 2060 itself. PAS 2060 still remains one of the most current in terms of your objectives for carbon neutrality. But with the publication of 14068 likely to be into late 22 and early 23, it's something where the applicability of the consumer confidence and trust and the likes towards carbon neutrality, ISO themselves see this as a worldwide, a global applicable standard in order for organisations to look and determine their carbon footprint.
So how about in the future then, Dan, looking to the next 5 to 10 years as organisations try to take on this challenge of carbon neutrality? Where do we go next?
I think it's an interesting point. So if I look back on my career with BSI so far and the variety of organisations I've worked with to support from a quality, environmental or health and safety perspective, I think never more has there been a time where organisations are doing their own self-reflection, posturing and seeing what their impact is. And from a sustainability avenue, I think the applicability of the standards I've mentioned, the 14,001, 50,001, are very much there. But with ISO committees meeting to understand from a carbon and a net zero perspective, I think that area is only going to grow. I think from the conversations I'm having right now, where people are understanding PAS 2060 for the first time, where they're at in their journey is still trying to define their own and measure their own carbon footprint. I would like to see in 5 years' time, you would have organisations that would know their scopes 1 and 2 intimately, and then, of course, having their reliance on their suppliers to inform them from their scope 3 aspect. Where if you could think of it in organisations from supermarkets and the likes, they're, of course, requesting of their suppliers their scope 3 emissions, because that is indeed the scope 1 and 2 of indeed the supply chain companies. And I think from looking now into the next 5 years, organisations will be requested to share their carbon footprints and share that externally. And this, I would imagine, would be linked to shareholder responsibility and shareholder satisfaction, to have organisations impart that knowledge, to share that and understand that, so that organisations can really understand their impact. That may be legislative led. There's already communication in terms of UK carbon tax and carbon levies. There are already communications from a government perspective that access to certain contracts and tenders are led by the organisation's understanding of their carbon footprints, so that can only go to support that of the clients that they are satisfying. So in the next 5 years, I think to be able to substantiate these claims and understand from a carbon footprint perspective that this isn't led by opinion, it is led by the data, PAS 2060 absolutely is the standard for that.
My thanks to Dan Kuszpit for this particular certification conversation, and to you for listening. To find out more about PAS 2060, visit bsigroup.com/PAS-2060. The next episode in this series is on the Customer Service Kite Mark. Exclusive to BSI, this Kite Mark certification is based on British and international standards and regular measurement of customer satisfaction. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the BSI Education podcast now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education podcast. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.